The sun beat down mercilessly, a blinding white fireball suspended in the endless blue. Heat waves shimmered across the barren expanse, distorting the horizon into rippling illusions of water that would vanish the moment you reached them. Jackson Cole rode with his head pulled low, his shadow trailing long behind him in the late afternoon glare. His chestnut stallion Duke moved with the steady, unhurried gait of an animal that knew the desert's rhythm, each hoof sinking into the soft sand before lifting again, leaving a line of prints that the wind would soon erase. Jackson wasn't a man who strayed from his route unless he had to. His life had taught him that detours often led to trouble, and trouble was the one thing he had no patience for anymore. Folks in the nearby towns whispered about him, called him cold, unfeeling, a man who had cut himself off from the world after the fire that had taken his wife and child. 10 years back, they said his heart had turned to stone, that nothing human could reach him now, and for the most part, they were right. But the desert had its way of putting things in front of you that you didn't expect. That day, as he approached the edge of a dry arroyo, the deep gully carved by years of flash floods, he noticed something off. A buzzard wheeled lazily in the sky above, and on the pale sand below, two shapes lay motionless. His first instinct was to keep riding. Out here, dead things were common. The desert took the careless, the unlucky, and the weak without pity. He wasn't a lawman or a preacher, and what lay in the dust wasn't his concern. Still, his eyes narrowed, his grip on the reins tightening as Duke slowed to a stop. The wind carried the faintest sound to his ears, a dry, almost inaudible cough. Jackson dismounted, his boots crunching against the gravel, one hand resting on the handle of his revolver out of habit. The closer he got, the more details came into view. They were women. Their dresses were torn and coated in dust, the fabric clinging to their bodies as if it had been soaked and dried a dozen times. Their hair was tangled with sand and grit, and their faces were burned from the sun. But what struck him most were their hands, bound at the wrists with coarse rope, the skin rubbed raw and bleeding. Their lips were cracked, their breathing shallow, their eyes half-lidded and unfocused. Jackson's jaw tightened. Whoever had left them here hadn't just abandoned them. They'd meant for them to die. That was clear as daylight. One woman, slightly older, lay on her side, her breathing labored. The younger one, no more than 20, maybe, stirred faintly as his shadow fell over her. Her eyes flickered open, revealing dark irises dulled by exhaustion. She blinked up at him, confusion and fear warring in her gaze. Jackson crouched beside her, pulling the canteen from his belt. Easy, he muttered, his voice low and even. He tipped the canteen just enough for a trickle of water to reach her lips. She drank greedily, coughing as the cool liquid hit her throat, then gestured weakly toward the older woman. He hesitated for the briefest moment. This wasn't his fight. He could give them water, maybe cut them loose, and ride on. But as he looked at the older woman's pale, sunburned face, something stirred in him, an echo of a memory he'd buried deep. Years ago, he'd come across another person dying in the dust, but that time it had been his wife after the fire, and he'd been too late. That had been the moment the desert had claimed whatever softness he had left. But here and now, these women were still breathing. That made all the difference. He pulled his hunting knife from its sheath and sliced through the ropes around their wrists. The younger woman flinched at his touch, then stilled as the bonds fell away. "Drink," he said, passing the canteen to her again. She took a careful sip before leaning over to help the older one drink. "Where's your camp?" he asked. Though he already suspected the answer. The younger woman shook her head weakly. Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "No, he camp. He left us." Jackson didn't ask who he was. There'd be time for that later, if there was a later. He scanned the arroyo. No tracks except his own. No sign of wagons or riders. Whoever had done this was long gone. He stood and glanced toward the horizon. They were miles from anywhere, and the sun was already dipping low. If they stayed here, they wouldn't last the night. With a quiet curse, he knelt and lifted the older woman in his arms. She was light, frighteningly so, her head lolling against his shoulder. The younger woman tried to stand, but her legs buckled, and Jackson caught her with his free arm. "Come on," he muttered, leading her toward Duke. He set the older woman in the saddle first, then helped the younger one climb up behind her. With both women swaying unsteadily, he swung up behind them, his arms braced to keep them from slipping off. As Duke started forward, Jackson cast one last look back at the arroyo. The desert swallowed their footprints almost immediately, erasing all trace of what had happened there. But Jackson knew it wasn't erased from him. Not yet. Asterisk. They rode on in silence, the sun bleeding red and gold across the sky, the wind carrying the faint sound of coyotes calling in the distance. The women leaned against him, too weak to hold themselves up, and for the first time in years, Jackson felt the weight of another's life in his hands, and realized he wasn't ready to let it go. The desert night was a living thing, colder than a man could believe after the blistering heat of day. The wind cut like a knife, carrying with it the dry whisper of shifting sand, and the distant cries of nocturnal predators. Jackson kept Duke at a steady pace, knowing the stallion could navigate in near darkness better than most men could on foot. The two women rode ahead of him in the saddle, their heads lolling as exhaustion threatened to pull them under. He kept one hand on the reins, the other steady against the younger woman's back, making sure she didn't slip. Asterisk. By the time the pale outline of his small ranch house appeared against the stars, his muscles ached from holding them upright. It wasn't much of a place. A single-room cabin with a lean-to stable and a well that had just enough water to keep a man alive if he rationed it. But tonight, it was more than these women would have had if he hadn't found them. Asterisk. He swung down from the saddle and caught the younger woman as she tried to dismount, her knees giving out the moment her feet hit the ground. She clung to his shirt for balance, her skin cold despite the lingering heat in the air. Inside, he said firmly, guiding her toward the door before going back for the older one. She was barely conscious, murmuring something unintelligible as he lifted her into his arms. Asterisk. Inside the cabin, the air was still and smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. Jackson set the older woman down on his narrow bed and draped a wool blanket over her. The younger woman stood awkwardly near the door, her eyes darting around the sparse room as though trying to decide if she was safe. Jackson didn't miss the way her shoulders tensed when he moved too quickly. Whoever had left them in the desert had left more than just physical wounds. Asterisk. He moved to the fireplace and began stacking kindling. Name? He asked without looking at her. Asterisk. She hesitated before answering, her voice raw. Clara. Her name's Ruth. Asterisk. The names hung in the air like fragile things. He lit the fire, and the flames began to crackle, throwing a warm glow over the room. Clara sank into the only chair, pulling her dust-covered skirts close around her. Her eyes followed his every movement, suspicion and exhaustion warring in her gaze. Asterisk. You from around here? Jackson asked, pulling a pot from the shelf and filling it with water from the jug. Asterisk. Clara shook her head. We came with. She trailed off, lips pressing into a tight line, with my husband and hers. We thought we were going to California. We didn't make it far. Asterisk. Jackson didn't push for details, but he caught the flicker of pain in her eyes when she said husband. He'd seen that look before. The kind that told you whatever had happened out there wasn't an accident. Asterisk. He set the pot over the fire and moved to check Ruth. She stirred weakly when he adjusted the blanket, whispering Clara's name. Clara was at her side in an instant, taking her hand and murmuring softly. Asterisk. Jackson watched for a moment before turning back to the fire. He'd learned a long time ago not to get tangled in other folks' tragedies, but here they were, in his home, and whether he liked it or not, he was part of this now. Asterisk. When the water boiled, he dropped in dried beans and a handful of jerky, making a simple stew. The smell began to fill the cabin, and Clara's eyes followed the pot as if willing it to finish cooking faster. Asterisk. You'll eat first, he said, ladling some into a tin bowl. Clara hesitated, then took it with a quiet thank you, her voice barely above a whisper. She ate slowly at first, then faster, as though afraid he might take it away. When she was done, she glanced at the pot. Jackson handed her another small portion without a word. Asterisk. When Ruth was awake enough to swallow, he helped her sit up and fed her carefully, one spoonful at a time. Her hands trembled, but she managed to finish the bowl. Clara settled her back against the pillow, relief softening her features for the first time since he'd found them. Asterisk. Jackson leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. You can stay here tonight. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next. Asterisk. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Why? Asterisk. The question caught him off guard. Why what? Asterisk. Why help us? She asked. Her voice wasn't accusing. It was weary, as if she couldn't quite believe anyone would do it without wanting something in return. Asterisk. He thought about that for a moment. Because I found you alive. That's reason enough. Asterisk. Her eyes searched his face, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Finally, she nodded, pulling the blanket tighter round herself. Asterisk. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that danced along the walls. Outside, The wind howled through the desert like a mournful psalm. Jackson sat in silence, listening to the women's breathing grow steady as sleep claimed them. He told himself it was just for the night, just until they were strong enough to move on. But as he sat there, the memory of their cracked lips and bound wrists wouldn't leave him. Neither would the way Clara had looked at him when she asked why. Something in him shifted, so slight he almost didn't notice. For the first time in a long while, the cabin didn't feel as empty as it usually did, and Jackson realized with a grim sort of certainty that when morning came, sending them away might be harder than he wanted to admit. Morning broke with a pale, washed-out light that spilled over the desert like a slow tide. The air was still cool, but the promise of punishing heat lingered on the horizon. Jackson had been awake for hours, sitting on the porch with a mug of bitter coffee, his head pulled low as he watched the sun creep higher. Inside, the soft sounds of movement told him the women were stirring. He didn't turn to look when Clara stepped out into the morning air, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She moved stiffly, every step careful, like each one reminded her of yesterday. Ruth's still sleeping, she said quietly, as though speaking too loud might break the fragile peace that had settled over them. Her eyes flickered toward the corral, where Duke was already grazing. You take good care of your horse. Jackson sipped his coffee. Better company than most folks. It was a half-truth. Duke didn't ask questions, didn't expect anything more than a steady hand and enough water to keep him alive. Jackson liked it that way. Clara stepped closer to the edge of the porch, her gaze sweeping across the endless stretch of sand and scrub. It's strange, she murmured. Out there, it feels like it's trying to kill you. In here, she trailed off, glancing at him with something almost like gratitude in her eyes. In here feels different. Jackson didn't answer. He didn't want to think about why her words made something tighten in his chest. He finished his coffee, set the cup down, and stood. We'll need water. The well's low. You can stay here with Ruth, or you can come help me haul it. She hesitated, then nodded. I'll help. The walk to the well was slow, the air already warming under the rising sun. Clara carried one of the empty buckets, her grip steady, despite her thin frame. Jackson said little, but he noticed the way she glanced around, as if expecting someone, or something, to appear on the horizon. When they reached the well, she set the bucket down and wiped a strand of hair from her face. I don't think I thanked you properly, she said, meeting his gaze, for last night, for saving us. You don't owe me thanks, he said gruffly, lowering the rope. I did what any man should do. Her expression told him she didn't believe that for a second. Most men wouldn't. He didn't argue, just hauled the first bucket up and poured it into the second pail. They worked in silence until both were full, then started the slow walk back. The weight of the water seemed to draw the words out of her. They left us. There, she said suddenly, voice flat. In the middle of nowhere, no food, no water. They didn't even look back. Jackson kept his eyes ahead, but his jaw tightened. Your husband's. She nodded once, her mouth a hard line. Said we slowed them down. Said they'd come back when they reached the next town. But I knew. Her voice trembled just slightly, and she tightened her grip on the bucket. I knew they wouldn't. The image of the two women in the sand, wrists bound, lips cracked, came back to him with sharp clarity. He didn't ask what she and Ruth had endured before he found them. Some things didn't need speaking to be understood. When they reached the cabin, Ruth was sitting up in bed, the blanket around her shoulders. She looked better, still pale, but with a spark of awareness in her eyes. Clara set the bucket down and hurried to her side, murmuring a few quiet words. Jackson busied himself with tending to Duke, but he kept glancing toward the cabin. It was strange, seeing his home with voices in it again. Strange, and not unpleasant. By midday, the heat was pressing down hard. Jackson fixed a simple meal of cornbread and beans, and they ate together in the small patch of shade by the porch. Ruth ate slowly, her hands still trembling, but she managed a faint smile when Clara teased her about eating more. After they'd finished, Clara sat quietly, watching him with a thoughtful expression. You said last night you'd figure out what comes next, she said finally. What did you mean? Jackson shrugged. I can take you to the nearest town. There's a stage runs through once a week. From there, you can go wherever you're headed. Clara exchanged a look with Ruth, then shook her head. We've got nowhere to go. It was the way she said it, not just as a fact, but as something final, that caught him off guard. Family. Not anymore, she said softly. And even if we did, they wouldn't take us back, not after this. He didn't push. He'd spent enough of his life running from his own past to know that sometimes the only thing a person needed was a place where no one asked questions. That night, the air was warm and still, the desert sky a vast black sheet studded with stars. Ruth slept soundly, her breathing even, while Clara sat near the fire, her hands curled around a tin mug. Jackson sat across from her, oiling his rifle, the crackle of the flames the only sound between them. Why do you live out here? She asked suddenly. He looked up, meeting her gaze. Because it's quiet. Because nobody comes looking for me. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Maybe I understand that more than I want to. She stared into the fire for a long moment, then added, when you found us, I thought you were just another man who'd pass us by. I didn't think anyone would stop. Jackson set the rifle down. Sometimes, he said quietly, a man surprises even himself. Her eyes softened, and for the first time since he'd met her, the tension in her shoulders eased. She didn't look away, and he didn't either. The firelight flickered between them, and in that quiet, something shifted, a fragile thread of trust weaving itself into place. Neither of them said anything more, but when she finally stood to help him bank the fire for the night, her hand brushed his. It was the smallest touch, light as a breath, but it was enough to send a jolt through him. For years, Jackson had built walls as high as the desert sky, telling himself it was safer that way. But that one touch, hesitant, unplanned, felt like the first crack in the stone. And as he lay in his bedroll later, listening to the steady rhythm of their breathing, he realized that maybe, just maybe, the emptiness he'd been carrying for so long didn't have to last forever.